Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History, as we look today at life in America during the 1920s. Now, the decade after the Great War was a period for many Americans of great prosperity. Although for farmers, it was a period of bad fortune, as food prices fell shortly after World War I ended. But most Americans were able to enjoy their prosperity with not just more money, but more free time than ever before. For most Americans, wages were rising, but they are also enjoying shorter working hours and a shorter work week. The average work week fell from 70 hours in 1850 to 55 hours in 1910 to 45 hours in 1940, giving people more time and money to enjoy themselves. Furthermore, after the destruction of the Great War and the Spanish flu, Americans wanted to cut loose, so the 1920s are often remembered as the Roaring Twenties. And Americans had new ways to enjoy themselves. Movies were new, or at least much improved over the early silent films, and much cheaper at only 5 or 10 cents a show than going to a play or a concert. The first movies had no sound, or at most came with recorded music or sheet music for the theater band or orchestra to play along with different scenes, as a kind of mood music, but not typically with sound effects or talking. But even silent movies created new worldwide celebrities. The comedian Charlie Chaplin, the handsome chic Rudolph Valentino, and Clara Bow, known as the It Girl, who became an ideal of feminine beauty for the 1920s. And then, in 1927, Al Jolson starred as the jazz singer in a movie based on his own life and considered the first talkie. Although, to be fair, the synchronized sound in the movie only takes up a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes at most. For the most part, the music is simply recorded background singing and mood music. But even a few minutes of synchronized sound was a technological breakthrough, and within a few years, all movies were talkies. And movies were available for anyone who wished to go out, but people could take part in America's growing mass culture. Shared news and entertainment at home, too, thanks to the radio. Radios had existed before the 1920s, but had been fairly rare, as prior to this, you had to order them as a kit and put them together yourself, so radio was largely a hobby for nerds. But pre-built radios brought music and news and sports into everyone's home. Allowing the popular music from Tin Pan Alley in New York City to be heard across the country, and allowing regional styles of music to become nationally popular. Jazz music, of course, spread from New Orleans around the country and around the world, thanks to the radio and before that the record player. Here we see the radio bringing the blues from Memphis to a family that, just from the look of them, probably didn't often go into blues clubs in person. This also brought country music from southern Appalachia to the rest of the country. One of the early country music stars, Ernest Stoneman, went to New York City from southwestern Virginia and recorded traditional old-timey songs from southern Appalachia, although he also recorded modern music. One of his most popular hits was about the sinking of the Titanic, not exactly a traditional folk song brought from Elizabethan England. Music producers in New York were impressed and asked if there was anyone else who could sing like him. And he said, "Come down south and I'll show you." Recording sessions were held in Johnson City, and most famously the Bristol Sessions, in which local musicians were invited to come in, perform, and be recorded, creating some of the first country music stars, including the Carter family, with AP and Maybelle and their daughters, and later their other relatives too, performing music to this day. And down in Nashville, the Grand Ole Opry began to broadcast in 1925, making that country music and variety show the oldest continually broadcast radio program in the United States. So Nashville describes itself as Music City, USA, and Bristol as the birthplace of country music. And while many things that Americans had traditionally respected and admired were being treated a bit more cynically in the 1920s, Americans did find new heroes. Besides film celebrities, sports stars became national heroes. Boxing was one of the most popular sports in the 1920s, and Jack Dempsey, one of the most popular boxers of the decade. Babe Ruth, a great baseball player, became nationally famous. Well, he was particularly significant as he helped Americans get over the Black Sox Scandal, in which the Chicago White Sox deliberately threw the 1919 World Series, losing the series mostly because they were bribed, but also because they hated the team owner anyway. It was known as the Black Sox Scandal because the team owner was too cheap to pay for laundry services for the White Sox. In any case, baseball players in those days weren't that well paid. The bribes really meant something, in addition to spiting the team owner. But this had made Americans cynical even about our national pastime. Americans, too, were amazed by flight. Airplanes were still fairly new and dangerous, and so air shows were popular. Men who had risked their lives flying in World War I now risked their lives to entertain the masses and to set records, flying across the country, even flying across the ocean. Perhaps the most famous and respected American of all by the end of the 1920s was Charles Lindbergh, who, in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, became the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. His plane was stripped down to make it as light as possible. A light wicker seat, no radio or other instruments. He was able to make it to Paris only by flying down low when he finally saw land and shouting at Irish shepherds he flew past, which way to France. But he made it in 33 hours. With no sleep, no instruments, only a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. And he made air travel so popular that commercial air travel grew by 3,000% between 1926 and 1929, although from a pretty low base. A little over 5,700 people flew as passengers in 1926. It got up to 173,000 by 1929, but some airports handle more than that in a day or two now. And as traditional attitudes declined, women began to experience and explore new things too, both because of changing attitudes and also changing technology. As electric appliances made things that had once been very time-consuming for women, who were still expected to maintain the home, much easier. One could vacuum a rug rather than taking it outside and beating all the dust out of it once a year. An electric washing machine or an electric iron were easier to operate than a hand-powered washing machine or an iron you had to heat on the stove or in the fire. An electric oven was much better than a coal-powered one. And while it may not seem especially glamorous, a lot of freedom came from appliances. And these new women, as they were often called, wore short skirts, sometimes revealing their knees, or nearly. Let's not go too far. Many cut their hair into short bobs. They danced to modern music, drank in illegal speakeasies, sometimes drove without a man in the car. And while they were typically known as new women in the 1920s, they were also known as flappers. And this is a term they're usually remembered as today. And traditional attitudes were even changing about the mind. Sigmund Freud did not invent psychology, but he helped to make it popular. And in his books and lectures asserted that people were mostly driven by subconscious desires, rooted in animal instincts, or developed during childhood. Many having to deal with when a person was weaned or how he was potty trained. And people's animal urges and subconscious desires were only barely restrained by conscious reason. Some people saw this as insulting to human intelligence. Others saw it as an explanation for the strange behavior they saw, or perhaps an excuse. And while many of Freud's theories are largely discounted by modern psychologists, they are very widely discussed and influential in the 1920s. And so the writers of the lost generation often criticized the world around them. Sinclair Lewis wrote many books, and many, although not all, criticized the emptiness of middle-class life. In Main Street, the female protagonist graduates college, marries a moderately prosperous man in a small Midwestern town, and tries to bring modern ideas and excitement and fashions to the town, but is constantly thwarted by simply the conservative lack of understanding of her new ideas. And having a female main character was a bit of a new idea. And while the main character does eventually find some freedom and satisfaction in the end, it's by leaving behind many of the traditional expectations for a woman. Perhaps Sinclair Lewis's most popular book was Babbitt, which a wealthy real estate developer of the upper middle class in a fictional Midwestern city is prosperous but also not satisfied. His wealth does not seem to bring him satisfaction or meaning. Indeed, he's confused by all the changes around him. His oldest daughter is becoming a flapper, and he doesn't approve but doesn't know what to do about it. He hopes his son will go to college, but he would rather go to trade school and learn to be a mechanic because he's fascinated by cars, the latest in technology. His wife has begun to experiment with spiritualism, as some Americans, in turning away from traditional religions, sought new forms of spiritual fulfillment. Babbitt eventually has an affair with a nonconformist bohemian woman, but soon discovers that she and her friends are all nonconformist in the same way, in their own way, have a shallow and unsatisfying existence. Babbitt does eventually find some peace in the end of the novel by accepting life as it is, but not really joy. Of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald, in many of his works, looked at the hollowness of the upper class. Jay Gatsby, in The Great Gatsby, reinvents himself when he becomes wealthy, but never achieves his real dreams. William Faulkner primarily wrote stories set in the Deep South, presenting a strange, backward, almost inbred society, in contrast to other works set in the South prior to this, which often romanticized the South. Novels such as Gone with the Wind would be more symbolic of the typical writing about the South before this, but Faulkner and others began to write in a style known as Southern Gothic, a darker, even perhaps sinister view of the South. And Ernest Hemingway tried to strip writing down to its simplest forms, and also wrote, among other things, about the loss of belief in great causes, such as war. He had served as an ambulance driver in the First World War and came to see war and all that it seemed to stand for as futile. But this complaining that life is so good, so easy, that it's kind of boring and unsatisfying is something that, while I hesitate to use the slang of the youth of today, I think could be characterized as white people problems. Because for African Americans, things were different. A black middle class was growing in the northern cities that had seen a lot of black immigration in that Great Migration, as black people sought better paying work in the cities during and after World War I, particularly in the up-and-coming middle-class black neighborhood of Harlem, New York. And with some wealth, some free time, black people began creating new art, new music, new literature, in what today is often remembered as the Harlem Renaissance, but then was often called the New Negro Movement. In some ways, jazz music is part of this, or at least related to it, as black people moving north in the Great Migration helped to spread jazz music and make it popular among white Americans. Louis Armstrong was one of the most famous jazz musicians in the country. Indeed, the 1920s are often known as the Jazz Age. Although as jazz music became increasingly popular, many conservative Americans began concerned that a black style of music, seen by many as too exciting and suggestive, was becoming popular among young white Americans, making the rise of jazz very controversial, partly for racial reasons, just as would be the case with rock and roll in the 1950s or rap in the 1990s. There were many black writers in the Harlem Renaissance. One of the most famous was Langston Hughes, who wrote books and plays and poetry, in at least some of which, including one of his most famous poems, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He celebrated a black culture and heritage as being just as ancient and deep and meaningful as white culture. That black people had been accomplishing things just as long as Europeans had. And that black culture didn't just need to be a cheap copy or imitation of white culture, but was valuable and original in its own right. The most prominent female black writer of the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston, but these were one of only two of many. Black writers had helped African Americans develop a new sense of pride, some even going as far as to support black nationalism, and a pride seeking complete independence from white society. Marcus Garvey is one of the most famous black nationalists of the 1920s. He designed his own military-style uniforms and many other outfits as he promoted black nationalism. Through his Universal Negro Improvement Association, he tried to support or even found black-owned businesses to promote black wealth and give black people somewhere to do business so they could boycott white-owned businesses. He published his own newspaper, The Negro World, and had plans to found factories, grocery stores, restaurants, and even a cruise line, the Black Star Line, to compete with the famous White Star Line. And with the wealth he hoped to build, perhaps he could even lead his people back to Africa, to develop Liberia as a homeland for blacks who could then liberate the rest of the continent. All of which was seen as dangerous by the U.S. government, and somehow the FBI got spies into Garvey's organization and eventually charged him with mail fraud, mostly related to using the mail to seek investment in the Black Star Line. And it is quite likely Garvey skimmed some money off for himself, but he was mainly targeted because he was a black man becoming too powerful. After serving part of a 5-year jail term, he was freed early on the condition he leave the U.S. for his birthplace in Jamaica. W.E.B. DuBois believed that Garvey was a genius, but a dangerous one, by trying to do so much so quickly, and to be sure with some corruption involved, he could frighten the other races black people would have to work with. Again, as demonstrated by the fear black nationalism promoted, leading to the FBI investigation that brought Garvey down. Although Garvey did work with some unusual partners, meeting with leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, because he felt they understood each other. They both shared the goal of the complete separation of their races. Plus, Garvey believed every white person was really a Klansman inside. At least KKK members were honest about their racism. And so while the Roaring Twenties were a time of economic prosperity, it was also a time of cynicism and of paranoia. Much of that paranoia inspired by the communist revolution in Russia, which had overthrown the monarchy, led to a 5-year civil war, which finally produced the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a communist dictatorship in the old Russian Empire. Indeed, the United States and many other Allied countries had been so worried about the threat that communism posed that between 1918 and 1920, forces from the United States, Britain, many of Britain's colonies, France, Italy, Japan, and other Allied powers sent troops into Russia to try to help the anti-communist forces in the Russian Civil War. The United States lost 424 lives in this struggle, but were not able to defeat the Bolsheviks, due in part to the bad organization and bad leadership of the anti-communist Russians. And many Europeans and Americans worried communism might grow in their own countries and overthrow their government. And this paranoia grew in the late 19-teens and early 1920s into a Red Scare, a paranoid fear and persecution of communists and suspected communists. A paranoia often presented in the media and in history as completely baseless and unfair. But while it was sometimes unfair and often exaggerated, it was not entirely baseless. communists did mail bombs to a number of industrial and political leaders, including the Attorney General. Most were discovered before killing or injuring anyone, but not all. And the worst bombing took place on September 16, 1920, when a bomb in a horse-drawn wagon was set off on Wall Street at noon, killing 30 people on the spot, injuring hundreds of others, 8 of whom later died of their wounds. The deadliest act of terrorism in the United States history up to that point, surpassing the 1910 bombing of the Los Angeles Times building by Union activists associated with the communist movement, which had killed 21 people. And the bombing on Wall Street would not be surpassed as an act of terrorism until September 11, 2001. In response to this Red Scare, the Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, ordered the arrest of thousands of suspected communists and anarchists in what are known as the Palmer Raids. Some of these were legitimate arrests. Many, though it is true, were based on fairly flimsy charges. And as the Red Scare got well out of hand, to protect the rights of people accused of crimes that most people would not defend, the American Civil Liberties Union was founded in New York City in 1920, based though on earlier groups that had worked to protect draft dodgers, primarily communist ones, during the First World War. And the first famous case the ACLU was involved in was the case of Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti in 1920. These men were accused of involvement in a robbery and murder at a Boston shoe factory. On payday, an accountant and a security guard were walking a cash box from one building to another down the street. A car drove up, some men jumped out, shot both men, and made off with the cash box. The car was discovered later abandoned. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and put on trial, although on pretty slim evidence. Sacco probably did own the gun used in the crime, or at least one very much like it, based on early ballistic testing, and may have been involved. Vanzetti was even more weakly linked to the case, but both were known anarchists. Both, of course, were Italians, and many Americans feared immigrants. And while most Italians are Catholic, which is bad enough, as committed communists, these men were atheists. Another point against them. In the eyes of many Americans at the time, they very clearly got an unfair trial. Evidence was suppressed or ignored, the judge was clearly biased against them, and they were found guilty in 1920 and sentenced to death. Many people, even then, thought the conviction was based on pretty weak evidence. They appealed repeatedly, but were finally executed in 1927, although pardoned by the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, in the 1980s, for all the good it did them at that point. But this did lead to a decline in the Red Scare, as it did lead some people to feel it was getting a bit out of hand. That these men were probably innocent of this particular crime, but simply guilty of being who they were. Still, fears of immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, although also from Asia, led to Congress passing the Emergency Quota Act in 1921 to put many limits on immigration to the U.S., primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe and from Asia. Limitations made permanent and even stricter with the Immigration Act of 1924. One unfortunate side effect of this in the 1930s was as people tried to flee Europe from the United States to escape the rise of the Nazis. Many were prevented from entering the United States by this law. The most extreme group to oppose communism in many of the changes in the 1920s was the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was originally created in the 1860s to oppose Reconstruction, but had been crushed, at least officially, by the U.S. Army in the early 1870s. But it was reborn in 1915, inspired largely by the movie The Birth of a Nation, a masterpiece of a film, a 3-hour picture, The first screened in the White House, and Woodrow Wilson's favorite movie. Although there weren't that many movies at the time to choose from. And if you do not know the true history of the Klan, it's pretty moving, pretty thrilling when they all ride in to save the day at the end. If you know the real history of the Klan and Reconstruction, it's pretty creepy. But it inspired many people, and a second Ku Klux Klan was born in 1915. By the mid-1920s, it grew into an invisible empire, as they called it, of at least 3 million, perhaps 4 or 5 million members, who even staged a massive march on Washington, D.C. as an all-American organization. Because the Klan is not just new, it is improved. They don't just hate black people anymore. They still do. But now they also hate Jews, foreigners, communists, Catholics, atheists, moonshiners, prostitutes, and other unpopular groups. And much of the South operated as a terrorist wing of the Democratic Party to suppress the votes of people who might have opposed the bosses of the Southern Democratic Party. Although in the North, to which this new Klan spread, there were many Republican members too. And it did spread to the North, particularly the Midwest, where there was significant resentment against immigration from Europe, but also from the South, as black people did come north in large numbers in the Great Migration, competing against local whites for jobs and changing the culture. The Klan, of course, opposed its enemies through boycotts, through political action, and through outright violence, beatings, kidnappings, murders. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People opposed the Klan, of course, as did the Jewish Anti-Defamation League. But it was really the Klan that destroyed itself. Its leaders grew corrupt and began skimming off Klan funds. After all, there's a lot of money flowing to the Ku Klux Klan. You had to pay your membership dues, you had to buy your robes, and the leaders began to steal that money. They began to promote their friends' positions of power within the Klan, and corruption brought the Klan down in the late 1930s or 20s, and especially the 1930s, especially as people began to compare them to the growing fascist parties in Europe in the 1930s. The year 1921 saw the worst instance of racial violence in American history. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, which had a thriving black community, so wealthy that the black part of Tulsa was referred to as Black Wall Street. But trouble began when Dick Rowland, a black shoeshine boy, tripped in an elevator and grabbed the arm of the elevator operator, a young white woman. She was startled and she screamed. A clerk in the store accused Rowland of assault, although the woman herself never claimed to have been assaulted or tried to press charges. Dick Rowland fled the scene, but was arrested. Rumors spread that he would be lynched. He was held in a jail in the county courthouse, and a white mob gathered hoping to break him out and murder him. Hearing of this, 75 black men, some of them armed, went to the courthouse to defend it. The sheriff convinced the black men that he and his deputies could maintain order and protect the prisoner in a jail cell on the top floor of the courthouse. The black men began to go home, but a white man in the mob tried to disarm one of them. Someone fired a shot, a gun battle broke out, killing 10 white men and 2 black men, and sparking the Tulsa race riot, as white mobs rampaged through the black neighborhoods of Tulsa, killing people, burning and looting stores and homes. Fires broke out, but when the Tulsa Fire Department showed up, they were turned back at gunpoint. Some white Tulsans even flew airplanes over the black part of town, firing guns down from the planes and dropping firebombs. In some white neighborhoods, people who employed black servants were ordered to turn them over to the mob. Some did so, and their servants were beaten up. Some refused to turn them over and had their homes or businesses vandalized in turn. The riot lasted 16 hours until the Oklahoma National Guard came in and restored order by occupying points throughout the city and imposing martial law. And during this riot, at least 39 people were killed, although probably many more. There are 39 confirmed deaths, but estimates ranging up to 300 people who may have lost their lives. Over 900 were injured. And some of the deaths were certainly due to the fact that the black hospital was burned down during the riot, and most other hospitals were unwilling to treat injured black people. 10,000 people were left homeless, $2.25 million, at least $32 million in today's money, worth of property was destroyed, and many black people fled Tulsa afterwards. Dick Rowland, by the way, did survive, and the charges were dropped because the elevator operator did not want to prosecute the case. But many people did join the Ku Klux Klan or sympathized with it because it seemed to many people their traditional ways of life were under attack by modernism, new ways of life. The Great War and new technologies changed the way people lived, how ideas spread, what ideas were most powerful. Many people particularly felt threatened by a decline in religious belief, often blamed on scientific theories such as evolution. And in response, some people turned to fundamentalism, wanting to return to traditional values. They even said attacks on religion were a communist plot. And to be fair, the communists in Russia did try to destroy the church there, killing many of its leaders, persecuting its followers, and sometimes blowing up church buildings. Again, for many fundamentalists, Darwin's theory of evolution was symbolic of this modernist attack on their way of life. But this is an attack that they had to deal with as more and more rural people wanted their children to get an education. And education did spread into more and more rural areas in the early 20th century. But they wanted mostly a pretty basic education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, not high-flown theories by questionable scientists. In Tennessee, by the way, Governor Austin Peay put a lot of money into funding public schools. Furthermore, more and more Americans were graduating high school, going to college, being exposed to new ideas, and there were those who wanted to stop this. And the most famous attempt to do so was in Tennessee, where the Butler Act of 1925 outlawed the teaching of human evolution in public schools in Tennessee. Animals and plants might have evolved, but you and I are exactly the way God created us in the Garden of Eden. But there were many people who questioned this law, and it was decided to test this law in the town of Dayton, Tennessee, where some people wanted to test the law because they feared that if they didn't enforce it, nobody would. Indeed, Governor Austin Peay had signed the law largely in the expectation it wouldn't be enforced, but that it would please rural voters who were a little suspicious of what they saw as his urban agenda, with ideas like paving the roads. So some people in Dayton wanted to use the law to make sure it got used. Others wanted to test the law, feeling it ought to be overturned. But both supporters and opponents of the law in Dayton hoped that challenging the law there would make their town famous. And so, with assistance from the American Civil Liberties Union, a math teacher who had filled in for a time for the biology teacher in the high school in town was charged with teaching human evolution. John Scopes did not deny this and was put on trial. The Scopes trial would make Dayton famous, although not in a way that the leaders of the town hoped, as it was ridiculed as the monkey trial, drawing national attention from newspapers, magazines, and the radio, becoming the first trial broadcast on the radio, in fact, and drawing famous supporters to both sides. One of the leaders of the prosecution against Scopes was William Jennings Bryan, three-time candidate for the presidency, former Secretary of State, an outspoken religious fundamentalist opposed to the teaching of evolution. One of the leading defense attorneys was Clarence Darrow, a man famous for defending many people in controversial cases before this, including the bombers of the Los Angeles Times building, and most recently Leopold and Loeb, two young men found guilty of kidnapping, raping, and murdering a boy who attended a school near their home. There was no doubt that Scopes had broken the law, but both sides wanted to prove a point for or against the teaching of evolution, and drew so much attention to the cause that the trial eventually was moved outside, both because of the heat in the unair-conditioned courthouse and because the crowds threatened to crack the foundations of the courthouse with their weight. In the end, Scopes was found guilty. He did not deny breaking the law. He was fined $100, which William Jennings Bryan offered to pay out of his own pocket, although in fact the fine was never paid and the conviction was overturned on a technicality. But the Butler law remained on the books until the mid-1960s, when it was overturned in Tennessee, and a couple years later, a U.S. Supreme Court case challenging a similar law in Arkansas led to the banning of any law banning the teaching of evolution on religious grounds. Still, and Bryan was apparently so worn out by the heat and stress of the trial, he died in his sleep 5 days later, taking a nap after church. In his honor, Bryan College was founded in Dayton, Tennessee, where to this day you can be fired for teaching evolution. Still, while the case itself was open and shut, it was seen by many as a contest between fundamentalism and modernism. The national media ridiculed Tennessee and Bryan and the Butler Act, although many people who actually heard the trial felt that Bryan had done a fine job in his defense. Most people, I think, came out with the same opinion they had gone into the trial with. Modernism and traditionalism, or in some ways two different forms of traditionalism, also clashed over prohibition. The 18th Amendment had been ratified in 1919, banning the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol, and was put into force in 1920 with the Volstead Act, beginning prohibition. But many Americans still wanted to drink. Young people of the lost generation seeking more freedom from tradition. Likewise, many Americans, particularly immigrants, Italian, German, Polish, Irish immigrants, saw drinking as part of their traditional culture, unlike the more rural Protestant, old stock Americans who had come to oppose alcohol over the course of the 1800s. But the fact that young people and Catholics tended to oppose prohibition made some traditionalists support prohibition even more. But if people want alcohol and alcohol is outlawed, then only outlaws will have alcohol. So if it's illegal to manufacture alcohol, it will be manufactured illegally as moonshine, produced in stills behind people's homes and abandoned buildings, or in remote hollows or caves in southern Appalachia. If it's illegal to transport alcohol, it will be transported illegally by bootleggers, so-called because some transport alcohol in flasks stuffed down the legs of their boots, but people hid it in all sorts of clever ways, under their clothes, in secret compartments in their cars, in their luggage as they came back from Canada or Europe or the Caribbean. Indeed, this largely created the Canadian liquor industry. And if it's illegal to sell alcohol, it will be sold illegally in speakeasies. Clubs, often portrayed as music clubs or as restaurants, but where somebody with the right membership card or the right password could get in and have a overpriced drink in secret. And of course, all this crime requires a lot of organization, and so the 1920s saw the growth of organized crime. There certainly had been gangs and gangsters in America long before this, but they vastly expanded their organizations in the 1920s to supervise moonshining and bootlegging. The most famous of these mobsters was Al Capone, and while Prohibition had been meant to reduce crime, some of the violence associated with gangs was very high-profile violence. The St. Valentine's Day massacres, other very public murders, made many people feel that Prohibition had led to an increase in crime. Although some historians who have reevaluated this in recent years have found that while some very high-profile crime got a lot of attention, the average crime rate probably declined as fewer people were drinking. But for some, it made crime very profitable. And so, in 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment, ending prohibition at the national level, in the first and thus far only time we have amended the Constitution to unamend the Constitution.